In the aftermath of two world wars, the Holocaust, and the rise of Stalinism, one question haunted the 20th century. How could such absolute forms of domination emerge in modern civilization? Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher and political theorist, sought an answer, not in ideology alone, but in the deeper structural and social conditions that made totalitarianism possible. In 1951, she published The Origins of Totalitarianism, a sweeping, ambitious work that would become a cornerstone of political thought. Her central claim was stark. Totalitarianism is not just a more brutal version of tyranny. It is a radically new form of political rule, one that seeks not only to control actions but to dominate thought, identity, and even reality itself. To understand how such a system could arise, Arendt traces its roots through three converging historical forces. First, modern antisemitism, not the old religious prejudice, but a politicized hatred that turned Jews into scapegoats for economic instability and national decline. Second, imperialism, especially the European colonial ventures of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which hollowed out the legal and moral foundations of citizenship and replaced them with hierarchies of race and bureaucratic violence. And third, the emergence of mass society, a world in which traditional structures of belonging had broken down, leaving behind isolated, atomized individuals who were easier to mobilize and manipulate. Together, these conditions laid the groundwork for something new in history, a regime that doesn't just suppress dissent, but seeks to eliminate the very possibility of individual freedom. This is where Arendt begins her analysis and where we begin our journey into the anatomy of totalitarian power. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt insists that anti-Semitism in the modern era cannot be dismissed as mere bigotry or inherited prejudice. By the 19th century, it had become something far more dangerous, a political ideology. Unlike older religious animosities, this new anti-Semitism was secular, systematic, and increasingly tied to national identity. As European societies modernized and liberalized, many Jews achieved social and economic integration. But this very visibility, Arendt argues, made them convenient scapegoats, symbols of disruption in a rapidly changing world. As empires declined and economies faltered, anti-Semitic politicians and demagogues seized the moment. They redirected public resentment toward an imagined enemy, the Jew as outsider, conspirator, or parasite. This was not about theology. It was a calculated move to channel instability and fear into mass loyalty. In Arendt's analysis, anti-Semitism became a tool of mass politics. It forged emotional unity among disparate social groups by defining a common other. It was also a rehearsal for what totalitarian regimes would later perfect, the manufacture of an enemy as a basis for mobilization and control. This ideological turn in anti-Semitism marks a crucial transition from scattered hatred to organized persecution, from prejudice to policy. It is here, Arendt suggests, that the modern machinery of exclusion and domination begins to take shape. Hannah Arendt turns next to imperialism, not simply as a chapter in colonial history, but as a key rehearsal for totalitarianism. European empires, she argues, exported a new kind of rule to the colonies, domination without accountability. In Africa and Asia, imperial powers imposed bureaucratic control without legal restraint, managing entire populations through race-based hierarchies and violence masked as administration. This was governance without citizenship. The colonized had no rights, only regulations, no voice, only decrees. And crucially, Arendt saw this as a break from European political traditions. The Enlightenment ideals of law, rights, and civic participation were suspended in the colonies, replaced by the raw exercise of power. But what began overseas didn't stay there. Arendt warns that these imperial habits, governing people without representing them, reducing humans to statistics, normalizing inequality, eventually crept back into Europe itself. The colonial mindset seeped into domestic politics, eroding the idea of citizenship even at home. In the wake of war and economic crisis, these tools of domination, surveillance, categorization, mass bureaucracy, were no longer reserved for distant subjects. They were turned inward, laying the groundwork for regimes that no longer ruled through law, but through force, propaganda, and fear. Imperialism, in Arendt's view, prepared the modern state to abandon its democratic foundations and taught it how to rule without consent. In the heart of the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt isolates the totalitarian movement as a novel and terrifying form of politics, one driven not by the pursuit of power for its own sake, but by an all-encompassing ideology that claims to explain every aspect of human existence. In Nazi Germany, that ideology was racial purity, the belief in the absolute superiority of one Aryan race and the necessity of eradicating inferior peoples. In Stalinist Russia, it was class struggle, the conviction that history was a linear march toward the triumph of the proletariat. In both cases, the ideology was not a mere tool of the state. It became the state. Propaganda churned out these all-consuming narratives. Newspapers, films, rallies, and architecture were deployed to reshape reality, presenting the leader as a near-divine figure and the party line as indisputable truth. Individual thought, Arendt warns, withers in such an environment where every fact is massaged to fit the grand narrative. Complementing propaganda, the secret police, the Gestapo, the NKVD, carried out the regime's will in the shadows. They did more than enforce laws. They manufactured fear. With arbitrary arrests, forced confessions, and sudden disappearances, they made terror the instrument of governance. No one knew if a whispered joke or a furtive glance could send them to prison or worse. Worse still, totalitarian terror was perpetual. It did not simply punish dissent. It kept every citizen in a state of constant anxiety. There was no safe haven. In your home, among your family, you might still be watched. By breaking down private and public life alike, terror obliterated the boundaries that protect the human spirit. Under this regime, people were no longer citizens or even subjects. They were members of a mass, interchangeable and expendable. The regime did not need loyalty or even fear. It needed submission to the ideology and the leader. Individuality, spontaneity, personal loyalty, all were stamped out in service of total conformity. Arendt emphasizes that this was not a failure of humanity, but the inevitable logic of totalitarian rule. Once a movement claims total truth and wields terror without restraint, it can never stop short. It must constantly extend its power into every mind, every home, every corner of society, until the individual self is erased. This is the dark genius of totalitarianism. It does not simply oppress, it restructures reality, turning people into puppets of ideology and terror, and it demonstrates that when ideology becomes absolute and terror becomes endless, humanity itself is in peril. Hannah Arendt believed that totalitarianism doesn't begin with violence. It begins with loneliness. In the final part of The Origins of Totalitarianism, she turns her attention to mass society, a world in which individuals are cut off from tradition, alienated from political life, and left without a sense of belonging. These atomized individuals, Arendt argues, are the perfect raw material for totalitarian movements. When people are uprooted socially, culturally, spiritually, they become vulnerable to grand ideologies that promise order, identity, and purpose. In such a world, facts become negotiable, and reality bends to the needs of power. She writes, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. It's not just lies that matter, it's the collapse of truth itself. When people stop caring whether something is true, they become defenseless against propaganda. In such conditions, Arendt shows, terror becomes total, not simply through violence, but through constant surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and the destruction of trust between individuals. This climate of fear erodes individuality. People cease to think for themselves. And that, Arendt warns, is where the deepest danger lies." She would later expand this idea in her famous study of Adolf Eichmann, a mid-level Nazi bureaucrat responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. Watching his trial in Jerusalem, she was struck not by monstrous hatred, but by his shocking normality. Eichmann, she wrote, was not a fanatic or sociopath. He was terrifyingly normal. He used cliches instead of arguments. He obeyed orders. He followed the rules. He never questioned them. This, Arendt called the banality of evil, The idea that great crimes can be committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who abandon critical thought. She put it bluntly, the essence of totalitarian government has consisted in the effort to make human beings forget that they possess a mind. Evil, in this sense, becomes not just deliberate cruelty, but thoughtlessness, a refusal to think, a refusal to judge. And in that vacuum, the machinery of oppression finds willing hands. Arendt's warnings were not confined to her time. She believed that totalitarianism is always a threat, not just from violent coups or military juntas, but from the quiet decay of civic life. It emerges when public discourse collapses, when facts give way to ideology, when people retreat into isolation and echo chambers. She reminds us that pluralism, the coexistence of different views and communities, is not a luxury. It is the foundation of freedom, and political thinking, the slow, deliberate act of judgment, is a moral responsibility. Today, when disinformation spreads faster than reason, when populist leaders undermine institutions, and when citizens feel increasingly powerless, Arendt's work speaks with renewed urgency. In her words, the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. And elsewhere, she warned, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. Her message is not one of despair, but of vigilance. Democracy is not guaranteed. Freedom is not automatic, and resisting totalitarianism begins not with grand declarations, but with small daily acts of thinking, questioning, and remaining human in the face of power.